Hello everyone, welcome to Bioworks. So our topic for today is menstrual cycle. Let's get started. So what is menstrual cycle? It is a typical cycle that occurs in all female primates including humans. And menstrual cycle is a 28 or 29 days long cycle which consists of cyclic changes that occur specifically in the uterus and the ovary of the female reproductive tract. Now, before we go into details of this cycle, let us understand few important terms that are relevant to the cycle. So first one is puberty. As we all know, puberty is the time or the age during which the reproductive organs start to mature. So at the time of puberty, menstrual cycle begins in females and the age when it starts is around 10 to 13 years. So there are two other important terms relevant to menstrual cycle. One is menarche and the other is menopause. So menarche is nothing but the beginning of menstrual cycle or the onset of menstrual cycle. And menarche usually happens at the time of puberty, that is 10 to 13 years. And menopause meaning permanent stoppage of menstrual cycle, which occurs at the age of around 40 to 45 years. Alright, then the entire menstrual cycle is controlled by four important hormones that I have listed here. First one is follicle stimulating hormone. We generally write it as FSH. Second is the luteinizing hormone, LH. Third one, the progesterone, which is also called as a pregnancy hormone. And the fourth one is estrogen, which is the female sex hormone responsible for female secondary sexual characteristics. So basically, these are the hormones that control the entire menstrual cycle. In the next section, I'm going to explain how these hormones are produced and what is their exact role in the cycle. So here I have shown a diagram to explain the site and the action of the hormones that are involved in menstrual cycle. So you all can see hypothalamus here. Hypothalamus is a part of midbrain. And to the hypothalamus is attached the pituitary gland. This is the pituitary gland. And this is the anterior pituitary. That is the bigger portion of the pituitary gland which produces major hormones. Now, first of all, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called as gonadotropin releasing hormone. I'm going to show that here. The hypothalamus releases a hormone called as gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and LH. I'm going to write that here, FSH and LH. So GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone that comes from hypothalamus. It stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. Now FSH and LH act on the follicles of the ovary. I've shown the female reproductive system here with the ovary, and these small circular structures you can see here are the follicles. So what are follicles? Follicles are basically small cellular sac-like structures, and they are seen present inside the ovary. Now, when a female baby is born, there are millions of follicles that are already present in her ovary, but at the time of menstruation, few of those follicles, they mature into a final mature Graafian follicle. Now, what is the role of FSH here? FSH, as the name suggests, it is follicle stimulating hormone, so it helps in basically stimulation of follicles. So it stimulates the follicles of the ovary. And why does it stimulate the follicle? Because the follicles have to mature, right, to grow into a Graafian follicle. And the major role of LH here, LH is mainly for ovulation. And we all know ovulation is basically release of ovum from the ovary. I'm going to talk about ovulation and role of FSH later into detail, but right now I'm explaining the basic concept of menstruation. Now, once FSH and LH act on the ovary, what happens next is there is formation of this mature Graafian follicle here, and this Graafian follicle, the cells of these developing follicle, they secrete important hormone called as estrogen. Estrogen is sometimes also called as estradiol. So Role of estrogen here is to control the female secondary sexual characteristics and also to repair the endometrium which ruptures at the time of menstruation. Now, endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus. I've shown it over here. This is the inner lining of uterus, which is considered to be highly nutritive for the growing embryo. So at the time of menstruation, when the endometrium ruptures, it is repaired again by the estrogen, which is released by the cells of the follicles. And along with estrogen, there is another hormone called as progesterone. I'm going to mention that here, progesterone, which is also called as pregnancy hormone. So I'll write the role for progesterone as well. Progesterone is the pregnancy hormone, and estrogen is involved in repair of endometrium. Alright, so that was a brief introduction to menstrual cycle. Let us now go into the details of the phases of menstrual cycle. Now here I have shown a brief overview of the entire menstrual cycle. As we know, the menstrual cycle lasts for around 28 or 29 days, and the entire cycle can be divided into 4 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 and phase 4, and I have listed the names of these phases. Phase 1 is the menstrual phase, which takes place from day 1 to day 5, that is 1st to 5th day of the cycle, followed by the follicular or the proliferating phase, which occurs on 5th to 13th day of the cycle, after which ovulation takes place in the ovulatory phase, which occurs on the 14th day of the cycle, and then luteal or the secretory phase is the last phase of the menstrual cycle, which occurs from 15th to 28th day of the menstrual cycle. Now, generally, on an average, most of the females have 28 or 29 day cycle, but some females may also have a longer cycle. In that case, the follicular phase may be a little longer. Generally, the luteal phase remains for 14 days, but the length of the follicular phase may be longer for those whose menstrual cycle is longer. We will now look into details of all the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. I'm going to start with the first one, which is the menstrual phase. This is phase 1, and it is also sometimes called as a bleeding phase. What is important to note over here is this phase occurs in absence of fertilization. So if there is no fertilization, or if there is no union of the sperm and the egg in the female reproductive system, then the menstrual cycle will take place and the first phase, menstrual phase, begins. Now, what happens exactly in this phase? There is rupture of endometrium. I'm sure you remember what is endometrium. It is the inner lining of the uterus, and it ruptures, or that means it breaks, and when it breaks, there is discharge of blood. Along with blood, there is mucus and unfertilized egg which is given out of the vagina. The rupture of endometrium generally happens because of low levels of both hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And at the end of menstrual phase, FSH begins to increase. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. Now, this hormone has a major role in the second phase of the cycle, and hence the level of FSH starts to increase at the end of menstrual phase. So this was a brief introduction to the menstrual phase, which lasts for around 3 to 5 days. Now, this is the second phase, follicular phase, also called as a proliferating phase. And as the name suggests, the follicles start to develop. So how does that happen? It happens because of increased level of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, that comes from the anterior pituitary. And follicle stimulating hormone acts on the follicles of the ovaries and stimulates it to develop and mature into Graafian follicles. Note that Graafian follicle is an enlarged mature follicle that contains the ovum. Now, once Graafian follicle is formed, these developing follicles that are formed in the ovary, they start to secrete estrogen. Now, what is the role of estrogen here? Estrogen is required to repair the endometrium. I had already mentioned some time back. So, estrogen repairs the endometrium that had ruptured previously in the first phase. So that is what happens in the follicular phase, and by the end of follicular phase, the Graafian follicle is ready to release the ovum in the next phase. So this is the third phase of menstrual cycle, the ovulatory phase, which occurs on day 14 for a 28-day menstrual cycle. Now what happens in the ovulatory phase is there is surge of LH. That means there is increased secretion of LH, that is luteinizing hormone, from the anterior pituitary. And because of increased secretion of LH, there is a rupture of Graafian follicle that occurs. So I have shown that in a diagram here. Now this is a TS, the transverse section of an ovary, where you can see the developing follicles, and then this is the Graafian follicle that is formed. Now Graafian follicles contains this egg or the ovum inside, and what happens in this phase is there is rupture of the Graafian follicle. You can see here the Graafian follicle has ruptured and the ovum inside it has released outside in a process called as ovulation. So this process, the rupture of Graafian follicle and release of ovum, is called as ovulation, and that is what happens in the ovulatory phase. What happens to the released ovum then? The ovum is picked up by the fimbriae, those finger-like projections in the female reproductive system. They pick up the ovum and it is further passed on into the fallopian tube, where it will be viable for another 24 hours when fertilization may or may not occur, and that depends on the presence or absence of the sperm in the female reproductive tract. So that was about ovulatory phase. Now I'm going to talk about corpus luteum here, which is more relevant in the next phase. So once the Graafian follicle releases the ovum, the empty Graafian follicle is converted into corpus luteum. You can see this is corpus luteum, and then corpus luteum gradually degenerates to form corpus albicans, which is a whitish scar that is formed. I will talk about the role of corpus luteum and corpus albicans in the next phase. And now let's see what happens in the last phase, which is phase 4, the luteal phase or the secretory phase. Now the remains of Graafian follicle. Now we know that in the previous phase, the ovulatory phase, ovulation has taken place and the Graafian follicle is now empty. Now this Graafian follicle, which is empty inside the ovary, it transforms into a yellow colored structure called as corpus luteum. Now this corpus luteum is extremely important. I'm going to highlight that over here for you. So corpus luteum is an extremely important structure here. It acts like a temporary endocrine gland because it secretes hormones. So it secretes progesterone and estrogen. These two hormones, progesterone and estrogen, they maintain the thickness of endometrium and they kind of prepare the uterus and the endometrium so that in case if fertilization takes place, the endometrium should be prepared to receive the embryo. Now, the points that I have mentioned here are in absence of fertilization. So let us see what happens if there is no fertilization. So corpus luteum degenerates. As I mentioned, corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine gland that is formed and it secretes progesterone and estrogen. Now, after a few days, corpus luteum degenerates and it is converted into something called as corpus albicans. It is a whitish scar that is formed, and this happens in absence of fertilization. And as corpus luteum degenerates, what will happen? There will be sudden drop in progesterone and estrogen, right? So the drop in progesterone and estrogen will cause menses. That means it will cause, it will resume the menstrual cycle and the menstrual phase will begin again. So that is what happens in absence of fertilization. So if fertilization has taken place, then progesterone and estrogen will be required because they maintain the thickness of endometrium. So in that case, corpus luteum will not degenerate. It will remain and it will continue to secrete progesterone until placenta formation takes place. And once placenta forms, placenta will take over the role of corpus luteum and it will continue further secretion of progesterone. Alright, so that was all about menstrual cycle. So hope the entire concept of menstrual cycle was clear to you all. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.